victims' rights and particularly focus on victims who are applying to participate in the proceedings at the ICC from Darfur. So I want to give you a brief overview of the Darfur situation since we didn't do it in the video. I want to make sure you have some background and context, which is important for then when we talk about some more practical experience and actually working with victims, particularly those from Darfur, because victim work can change case by case depending on where the victims are from. You have to be aware of the gender and cultural sensitivity, so it's important to understand the background. Darfur is one of the largest regions of Sudan, the largest, I think, and it is in the west side of Sudan, and Sudan itself is in the northeast of North Africa. The conflict has been going on for many, many years. Over a decade now has gone by since the genocide itself, which was in 2004 to 2005. What happened during that time was that the Sudanese government, as well as militia forces and other military forces, we have a picture of some, I don't know if you've heard of the film The Devil Came on Horseback. One of the reasons for the title was that often the militia forces, known as the Janjaweed, would come in either on horseback or on camels in this picture. And they systematically raped, tortured, killed, assaulted thousands and thousands of victims, mostly targeting non-Arab tribes, the Fur, the Mazalit, and the Zagawa, who are the Fur, the biggest tribe in Darfur. Mazalit and Zagawa are the second and third. The Sudanese government also has blocked humanitarian aid, so besides attacking and destroying villages, burning villages, raping, killing, assaulting, they also deny humanitarian aid, which is another route of violence, basically trying to starve the population and refuse any medical help, refuse any food or assistance. And they block UN investigators and other NGOs from entering the country in order to investigate crimes that are happening in Darfur. They just recently blocked investigators from investigating rapes that occurred, more than, I think Human Rights Watch reported more than 200 rapes that occurred in Tabet, which is in North Darfur, in 2015, and they couldn't investigate because AlBashir and the Sudanese government said, no, you can't come into the country. So that's one of the challenges that comes with working with victims from this region. The harm is, there's a variety of harm that the victims have suffered, and so I'm just going to give you some examples of the harm suffered. One, destruction of villages, which you saw in the picture where they would just burn entire villages, kill livestock, which is the main livelihood of many Darfurians, destroy other property, and force millions and millions from their home. To date, about 300,000 men, women, and children have been killed. Unknown number of women and girls have been sexually assaulted and raped. And about 2.6 million Darfurians have been forced from their home and are living either are internally displaced persons or are living in refugee camps right outside of the country. Then there are others that have fled the country completely, thousands that now live in Australia, US, Europe, across Europe, Chad, Kenya, the surrounding countries in Africa as well. And the reason that I mention these different groups is because of the victims that we primarily worked with at the International Justice Project were this diaspora population, because those are the ones who have access to. As Anna mentioned, even in Chad, it's very difficult to access the camps. It's very dangerous for even the victims living in the camps to speak to investigators, lawyers. So most of the applications that we would take concerning the ICC and victims would be from the diaspora populations in Europe and across the US. I want to highlight this picture because it is, well, number one, I didn't want to leave you just completely depressed from the emotional video as well as some of the photos. This is a picture from an internally displaced at IDP camp and women and children. And I want to just note that yes, there are victims, and we use the term victim because it's a legal term, but often you'll hear a small debate between calling them victims and survivors because there is sort of a negative connotation to the word victim, and so we don't want to just think of them as victims, they are survivors. And I think this picture is a good example with the beautiful colors and the dress and the, just the strength of the women, of how they are. You can't just think of them as just victims, that they are actually survivors of these crimes. And more than that, as much as we are lawyers and we go in and it's our job to speak to them and interview them and take the information, we have to remember that these individuals need to go, they will go back to their lives, whether their lives are in the camps now or they are back in Sudan or in a refugee diaspora community in the US. So whatever happens during the interview or during the process of you working with victims, we need to put that in the context of these people needing to go back. And so you have to treat that with a certain respect that goes beyond just the objective standpoint that you take as a lawyer, okay? The case at the ICC opened from a UN Security Council referral. That's how the Darfur situation opened. Now there are 4 outstanding arrest warrants. The president of AlBashir, the current head of state, Haroun, I'm not going to pronounce the whole name because there's like 4 names, and I will inevitably mess them up. So Haroun, who at the time he was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity, for the same events around 2005, his arrest warrant was actually in 2007, and it was one of the first ones to come out, to be issued by the court. At the time of the crimes he's accused of in the arrest warrant, he was the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, so a very high-up official in the government. Currently, he is the governor of South Kordofan, which is one of the new regions that the Sudanese government is currently targeting. It's a different region than Darfur, but so you can see the level of how high the conflict goes. The second arrest warrant is against Kashaib. His was also issued in 2007 for crimes against humanity and war crimes. He was a Janjaweed leader at the time. And the fourth one is Hussein, who was the Minister of Defense. His is the most recent arrest warrant issued in the situation in 2012, also for crimes against humanity and war crimes. There are 2 additional arrest warrants which were issued and which have been executed. So the 4 that I mentioned before are outstanding, meaning the suspects are on the run, as Charlotte said in the beginning of the lecture when she showed the picture of AlBashir. Those 2 Anna mentioned were Banda and Jerbo, and they both appeared. Did they appear before the ICC? What? On summonses, they appeared before the ICC, and those two cases deal with a different set of circumstances, a different set of violence, and so a different set of victims as well. The victims that we worked with at the IGP were victims who were trying to participate in the Bashir case, the Haroun, Kashaib, and Hussein. Okay, and another important element to note is that these, not only are the arrest warrants not being executed, but in particular AlBashir is allowed to travel with impunity. So he has been all over Africa. Most recently, he was in South Africa, and we thought that there was a chance he might be arrested there because the court, national court, had issued an order. However, he was permitted to leave the country before the appeals were finished and our decision was made, so he escaped again. He was also recently, I believe, he comes to Asia as well. He's been in Indonesia, I believe, and China, but I don't remember the dates exactly. A lot of the times he says he likes to say he's going to the United States every year. He says he's going to attend the General Assembly for the United Nations in New York, and every year there's a big outcry from the international community and the NGOs in New York to keep him from entering the United States. And almost every year he says, no, I'm not coming right before he's supposed to travel. But it goes to show you the extent to which the victims might be feeling the effects of the impunity. Because not only is he still in his position in their country, but he is permitted to go all around the world, essentially without any consequences. And then the ICC prosecutor, because this has been occurring, he's been traveling with impunity for many years now, the ICC prosecutor recently suspended the investigation, I think in an attempt to pressure the UN Security Council to, because there are states parties that are not enforcing the arrest warrants, and encourage the Security Council to take action against the states parties that are not following through with their duties to execute the arrest warrants. He travels to both states parties. He's been to both states parties, to the Rome Statute and non-state parties. So from the background now, I want to talk a little bit about just victims' rights generally at the ICC. There is, it's a relatively complicated process, and there are lots of rights. So I'm just going to focus on some of the basics, so that I could spend a whole lecture basically on the victims' rights part of it, and the legal part. So Article 63 of the Rome Statute is what gives victims the right to participate. And I just want to read the language because it's very important for you to understand the legal rule, basically, in taking the applications, like what you need to keep in mind when you're taking a story about the harm and the crimes from the arrest warrant that are alleged in the arrest warrants. So it says, victims may participate in the proceedings before the court at any stage, provided that their personal interests are affected, but they may not initiate proceedings, because the initiation of the proceedings, that's the job of the prosecutor. Where the personal interests of the victims are affected, the court shall permit their views and concerns to be presented and considered at stages of the proceedings determined to be appropriate by the court, and in a manner which is not prejudicial to or inconsistent with the rights of the accused and a fair and impartial trial. Okay, so you can see that in the Rome Statute, we are embracing a victim-centered approach and giving victims the right to participate in the proceedings, but also then there is a balance with the rights of the accused, because we cannot, you need to maintain the rights of the accused in allowing the victims to participate. We don't sacrifice the rights of the accused. Now, who is a victim? The rules of procedure and evidence define who is a victim. A victim is a natural person, so someone who is currently alive. It cannot be a dead person, although a family member who has lost another family member can apply. The person must have suffered harm. The crime from which the harm resulted has to fall within the ICC's jurisdiction. So that means that it has to be genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. That's if the victims are applying during the situation stage. Because remember, there's two stages in the beginning of a case. Well, there's more than two, but the part where we're talking about victim participation, you can have the situation open, so you have preliminary examination, and then they open a situation. When the situation opens, then victims may begin to make applications. From the situation, generally there are individual cases then opened after that. So when you're at the situation stage, the crimes that cause the harm of the victims must be crimes that are within the jurisdiction of the court. Once you're at the case stage, the harm must have resulted from crimes that are identified in the arrest warrants of that accused. So you can see that there needs to be a causal link between what happened to the victim and the crimes. Okay, so as I said, there are many rights that are either explicit or implicit in the Rome Statute and the rules of procedure and evidence, but I want to focus on 4 only. The first one being the right to attend and participate in proceedings, and as I said, that comes from Article 68. Participation at the investigation stage is mostly to clarify facts. Okay, so that's early on, to clarify facts. Later, the victims can also give their views at, say, sentencing and the reparation phases of the case. So when you see in the Rome Statute says at different stages of the proceedings that the court determines appropriate, those are just some examples of where and how they might do that. The second one is the right to receive reparations, which is in both Article 75 of the Rome Statute, as well as the rules of procedure and evidence, okay, 94 and 99. Not that any of us are going to memorize the numbers, but... and this means that they have the right to make, in their application, they can state what they would like or as reparations, so what they feel might remedy their harm. The judges determine which reparations may be appropriate on a case-by-case basis. So that means it can be different in every situation, in every case. So Darfur will likely be very different than the reparations that are ordered in Lubanga. So Lubanga is one of the cases where there's a conviction, and is one of the cases where there's a reparations order. Another element of the right to reparations is that there is the establishment of the trust fund for victims. That is funded by states parties, but also a somewhat independent organization. It's functions a lot like an NGO, and it can help fund the funds from that trust funds from victims, fund some of the reparations projects. They can start as early as the situation, and they can go until there's an order where they might carry out different projects at the time of the order, but they often start early. Like in Uganda, they've started very early, even though the cases are not really going forward at a fast pace. Okay, let's see. Also, the interesting thing about the reparations that were ordered in Uganda is that although you have the right to both collective and individual reparations under the rules of the court, the judge in Lubanga chose to focus more on a collective reparations model because of the number of victims and the type of harm suffered, and also because they wanted to think about reconciliation and how the reparations might play a part in reconciliation. So instead of just looking at an individual and how can we remedy this individual, a lot of it was how do we remedy a community. And that's a complicated thing to think about when you're talking about something like Lubanga, where you have child soldiers who may go back into their community. Child soldiers can be considered both victims and possibly perpetrators. So it can be a difficult task to parse out all these different elements when you're at the reparations phase. The interesting part is when I worked at the International Justice Project and we would interview victims, often on the application, I can't think of one victim that would actually ask, like, I would like monetary reparations for the harm, individual monetary reparations for the harm. I can't think of one that ever requested that. They themselves, at least in the Darfur situation, request community collective reparations. So it's often, can you please rebuild the school in my village? Can you please make sure there's a hospital? So so it gives you a little insight into how they also are thinking. And also, victims have the right to legal representatives. So I mentioned in the beginning that I worked for 2 legal representatives who represent victims in the Bashir case. The victims have the right to choose their own counsel. This has become slightly controversial at the ICC because of the number of victims and how complicated the process is. There's a move to try and appoint a common legal representative, which there's an argument that infringes upon the victim's choice in the counsel. So that could mean that, for instance, the victims in the US may have chosen Ms. Aiken and Mr. Brown as their counsel, but when they actually go to trial, a common legal representative could be appointed that is not Ms. Aiken or Mr. Brown. So that's an ongoing restructuring process. The registry is right now in the process of trying to make the model more efficient, but also keep the rights of the victims in mind. So we don't know how that will turn out yet. And the last right that I want to mention today, in terms of, because there are many, is that the ICC has a duty to ensure the safety of the victims and witnesses, but they must take all possible measures to respect the victims' safety, dignity, well-being, and privacy. So there is a very high level of confidentiality that needs to be respected, and that goes for when you're actually the person taking the application as well, not just when you're at the trial phase. It needs to be right from the beginning. These people are risking their lives when they are speaking out, and it's important that you protect not only them, but it's important for their families. A lot of them, if they've made it to the US as refugees, they may still have family back in Sudan who are in areas that are being targeted. So there is a high risk for them. All right, so those are some of the basic rights that are set out. The application process, as I mentioned briefly, starts when you have a situation. So when a situation opens, the victims may begin to make applications to participate in the proceedings. An application is long. It's a good 10, maybe 15 pages long. So as we're talking about the right to choose your legal counsel, that's important because when you have victims filling out these applications, needing to meet those requirements I mentioned, the actual person, harm connected to the crime, harm connected to the crime, and the arrest warrant, people cannot figure this out themselves. And NGOs too, unless you're a legal-based NGO, it's going to be difficult to make sure you have the right facts. So that's why the right to a legal representative is important both in theory and in practice. The application includes questions about their personal identity. It includes questions about the harm, questions about reparations that they would like, and I think those are the main ones. But it needs to be written out. It needs to be signed or thumbprinted if the victim can't write. Now, working with victims, it is definitely one of the most rewarding things I've done in my career, I have to say. It is both stressful because you become very, very connected to what's happening. You have a person right in front of you who represents what has happened, and even if you're in the US, millions of miles away from the actual violence, you now have this person sitting in front of you. So you can become very emotionally connected to the cases. That means that when you're working with them, you have to be aware of the process that you are taking to engage with them. So the ICC takes a victim-centered approach, and the future of international criminal law hopefully will also embrace a victim-centered approach. But what that approach actually is still sort of in the works. It's developing in the best way to do it. So I want to just give some important recommendations / suggestions and lessons learned that I experienced from my experiences with Darfurian victims. One of those, and probably the most important one, and the one that the ICC stresses, is that victims, the voicing of the views and concerns is very important in the process. So that is one of the most important parts of the process. It not only represents a part of the healing and the trauma, but also the justice. Victims, you will find, look at the process differently. So for some victims, the most important part might be telling their story to you. For other victims, it's having their application actually approved and stamped by the judge. It just depends. It's different for each individual. One experience that I had in the US, we used to go to different communities around the US, and we were in Philadelphia, which is in Pennsylvania. The organization was a New York-based organization, but we would go all over. And we would take interns with us, and we would do interviews, and you'd have to type it out and get it signed. And it was quite a process. We went during a very hot summer, and we would go to the refugee's actual house. This particular victim, we were interviewing to see if he would qualify in the Bashir case, the Harun case, Bashir or Hussein. And so those were the crimes that we were wanting to to ask about, and the dates that are in those arrest warrants were key for us. So I, of course, begin the interview, with the normal introductions, the normal establishment of trust, then get to, the actual filling out of the application. Well, I explained to him the jurisdiction of the court, 2002 up. I explained to him, some of the dates that are key in the arrest warrants. But what he wanted to do was actually tell me his story from about 1999 through to the present, because he had just arrived in the U.S. So several times through the interview, because it was hot in this house. My intern was about to pass out, and it was very, very hot, and no air, no fans, nothing. Of course, the Darfurians are fine because they come from very hot climate. We're sweating and dripping and ready to pass out. So, I keep trying to redirect him towards, some of the events that might have happened, not putting words in his voice, but asking him about the harm he may have suffered during these certain dates. And he keeps going back to these things that are way outside the jurisdiction, and finally says to me, after the third time, I'm nicely trying to redirect him, just to save some time. He says, I want to tell you my whole story. He says that, I want to tell you my whole story. So at that point, I realized what was happening. Okay, I had slightly forgotten, some of the importance of this whole process. So then we listened to the whole story, and he wanted me to write down everything. It was very important to him that it was written down in writing, and on the computer, everything. So, we were there for 6-7 hours taking the story. Probably the parts that you could submit to the application were, 2 or 3 hours we could have gotten the parts that we needed for the application, but we went through the whole thing. But that shows you how the process is actually important to the people, to the individual. One thing to consider when you are asking questions or engaging in this process is secondary trauma. So through telling their story again, for instance, for this particular individual, it was healing. For others, it can be traumatizing again, and they call it secondary trauma. So you need to also be aware of health professionals, mental health professionals, and others that you might be able to refer, not yourself, because obviously we're lawyers, we're not psychologists or mental health professionals, but you should have some referral numbers or some information for them to make sure that they can go somewhere. The ICC offers support in this way, but these victims are all the way over in the U.S., so they can't, and given the stage of the proceedings, it's not going to come from the ICC. So you need to be aware of that and have, resources for them to take advantage of. Another important thing is managing the actual expectation of the victims. For many victims, this might be their only chance at justice. Like Sudan, there is little chance that there's going to be a trial of the President Bashir in Sudan. So don't make promises. They already come in generally with very big expectations because they know, especially with the ICC, that this is one of their main opportunities for getting justice. Explaining the process in a very clear manner, and that means emphasizing that this takes a long time. Because as lawyers, we know how long court cases take, and in international justice, it's 10 times longer than in the domestic context. So they need to understand this, that even submitting the application is going to take a while. The judge is reviewing it, getting it approved. You might need to submit additional information to support the application. That takes a long time. And then they need to understand that that's not even the court process. Then we engage in the actual case, possibly at a later stage, especially here where the accused or the suspects are on the run. Although I've never met a victim who actually asked for individual monetary reparations, I think it is important in an interview to tell them that it's mostly collective reparations that the court has focused on, just so that they understand, the different types of reparations that are offered. Okay, now I'm sort of backing up a bit because we're going back to establishing trust with the victim. So this is more you want to both manage the expectations right at the beginning of the interview, but also you need to establish trust either at the same time or immediately before you begin talking about the court process. This establishing trust can be different, depending on, in the Darfur situation, depending on the tribe. There was different expectations of the interaction between maybe the Fur tribe and the Zagawa tribe with us. One of the things that we would do was try to learn a little Arabic, because that helps. You're trying to engage in the culture. You're trying to understand where they're coming from. Asking about families is particularly important to Darfurian victims. They're community-oriented and have very big families, so remembering personal details about the children, about the people themselves. This is what I started off with mentioning, that this can be very emotionally draining, because in order to establish this trust, inevitably, you're human, they're human, there's going to be a connection that's made, and so you bear some of that burden of the emotion that comes from establishing the trust, which is both good but stressful for yourself on occasion, mostly rewarding. You have to be very careful with gender sensitivity. So me as a woman speaking to Darfurian men was, one thing that there would be a certain, I could only go so far with what I would ask, or, if we had a male intern interviewing a female, that was pretty much, we never, ever, ever did that because it was a no-no. The gender divisions were too great, and the types of questions that you're asking about sexual violence are too sensitive to have that male-female interviewee relationship. So we would do women to women and men to men, just because we never knew what was going to come from the story. You don't know beforehand if the woman has suffered sexual violence. And men and women in Darfur communities sit separate sides of the room. That's how great the division is. So women will sit on this side, men will sit on this side. When you eat lunch, they eat on this side, they eat on that side, the children come to the women, but nobody crosses the line, including me. So I need to stay on this side to be respectful, at least to a certain extent, to show respect for the culture. Often as being the person doing the interview, you are allowed certain leeway, and they know that you don't understand everything. But you try, because that works towards establishing the trust and the respect that the victims deserve through this process. Then the other thing is having regular communication after an interview. And this is very difficult for NGOs because they're often understaffed. There's many victims. It can be demanding. You can receive tons and tons of phone calls. You could spend a whole day on the phone just answering questions. But it is important to maintain somewhat a regular communication. So you give them updates on where their application might be. Or maybe they just want to check in and see how, how it's coming along. Or maybe you want to just check in and make sure that the family is doing okay. How's their family in Sudan? That's really important. It is not a pleasant experience if they are interviewed and never hear from you again. That wouldn't be a pleasant experience for us, and it's not a pleasant experience for them. They feel very much abandoned if that happens. And I don't know about the rest of the world, but the communities in the U.S., the Darfur genocide was a huge, huge advocacy. The international community was outraged, especially in the U.S., and while it was happening right after, tons of money went into the NGOs that were doing the advocacy. None of that money went to actual victims, or very little went to victims or victim projects. So the Darfurians are very sensitive to feeling taken advantage of and using their story, just for the purposes of advocating a position of the NGO. So you need to be sensitive to it. I imagine it is similar in other victim communities around the world, but particularly for the one in the U.S., it's something to be aware of. And establishing trust can be complicated because you often have an interpreter with you. So not only is the trust, you have to use a lot of facial expression and body language to make the connection, and not just words, because your words are coming through someone else. And you need to be aware of what that other person might be saying. I don't speak Arabic, but I can tell if I say so many sentences and then he goes on for 10 minutes, somebody's interjecting their opinions and something else that I have not said. So then you need to stop that. So you need to have discussions with your interpreter before you start these types of meetings and interviews. Okay, and finally, I mentioned this in the beginning, but I just want to sort of sum up on this point. This is a it's very rewarding work, but it can be difficult, and you need to take care of yourself as much as you need to be aware of taking care of the victim. And then, I mean that in a mental health way. It can be physically draining as well. I remember going to a meeting where we were going to collect applications in Arizona, and I had gone by myself because we didn't know how many people would want to apply, or we didn't really even know how many people were in the community. Because Darfur, there's not when they come into the U.S., there's a number for Sudanese, but you don't know who's Zagawa, there's no checkbox for tribe on the refugee applications. So we never know how many people are in one city. Well, it turned out in this city there were many. And I had only been in contact with the community leader, who happened to be a woman. And yeah, I was expecting to talk to a few people, 5 people. I was only there for 2 days. About 30 people show up, all of which want to speak to you. And there's no way you can properly take all of those applications in one round. So it became more of an introduction session than an actual application session because I was by myself. And we have to go back to complete the process. But I remember clearly afterwards feeling so tired. At like 7 p.m. I just wanted to go back to the hotel and sleep. And it wasn't because I had run a marathon or done anything physical. It was just that it's so much energy and emotion that goes into this type of work that you can feel physically tired afterwards. And so you need to have a way to release that stress. You need to have a way, whether it's friends or exercise or something, you need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, because if you're not going to do anything good for the victims either. So it's a balance. And lastly, I just say it's very exciting because you work across different fields. It's not just, yes, you're acting as a lawyer, yes, you're doing legal work, but you also need to learn about where are the mental health services in this community, where the food, if they need extra food, they're not getting sufficient, they don't have a job right now, where can they get job training, where can they get extra support from food, if they're homeless, can you get them a house? You're not doing that, but you're connecting them with social service organizations that do that, and in doing so, you learn a lot about these different fields, and it's really interesting. It's a nice, you see the intersection of all the fields, and you see the importance. It gives you a very big picture of what justice means in the context. That's all.